And for everyone who is graduating from school right now, or who's in school, or who's ever been through a school, I'd like to talk today about the importance of challenging what are sometimes called narratives. In my latest book, I really go way beyond my first book in challenging narratives, official narratives. In fact, in between the publication of these two books, I had to really confront some of the narratives that I myself had bought into, and I have to tell you, it's not easy to challenge a narrative that previously seemed like it explained the events and facts pretty well, and to realize that it actually did not explain reality at all, that it was a false narrative you were holding on to. So I want to dig into this concept of a narrative because I think this is so important. When someone says a narrative, what does that mean? Well, a narrative actually just means a story, like a story that someone tells, like a narrator. But the way this word is often used means something like a really powerful, overarching story into which we fit all the events and facts that are going on in the world around us. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, in many ways, we actually have to have some kind of a model or fabric or storyline into which we fit all these facts and experiences so that we can make sense of them. Right now, as I'm recording this, it's June 2014, so it's graduation time around the world. Young men and women are graduating from colleges and universities and high schools. And when we're in school, we're hit with all these different facts from all different fields of study. And to make them fit together, there are narratives that are provided by teachers and that are reinforced by society. Storylines which try to give, for example, they give reasons for why things happen, like the Great Depression or World War II. There's kind of an accepted storyline about what causes or what caused those events. And whether or not those storylines actually tell you the real reason that the Great Depression happened is what we're talking about. The official or the conventional storyline might be the one that certain people want you to believe because it's safe for society, or that particular narrative tends to reinforce the actions that they want to take in the present. So when they're talking about what happened in the past, they want to get people to accept the narrative about what happened in the past so that they can get away with certain actions in the present by saying, well, you know, the Great Depression was caused by this, and then it was solved by this, and so therefore you have to let us do this today. So I think a really good metaphor for this concept of a narrative is a movie, which if you think about it, a movie is a very powerful story. A movie is such a powerful form of a story that it can almost take on a life of its own and start to become real to people, even when they know that it's actually not real. We can all think of movies or television series which are so well imagined that they've almost become a real place to millions of people. For example, Star Wars or Star Trek or Lord of the Rings, as if there's a real place in, somewhere where these fantasy worlds exist, even though we know that they're actually filmed on a set using special effects. They can become so real that people actually begin to use the movie as a way of interpreting the events in their own lives, or inserting themselves into that fantasy world to a pretty high degree. Like, for instance, we've all seen cars with bumper stickers that say Starfleet Academy graduate or whatever. And there's nothing wrong with that on one level, because the ability to use our imagination to create worlds that become real to some degree is really wonderful. It's a powerful aspect of who we are. And enjoying a fantasy world, there's nothing wrong with that. But we also know that there can be a negative side to this concept, especially if someone is living in a fantasy world to such a degree that they make bad choices. Bad choices that hurt themselves or others, or to a degree that they think that the movie in their head that they think interprets the real world somehow excuses them to use violence against other people, or excuses them, um, excuses manipulating other people in ways that violate uh, the other person's rights. So even if it doesn't go that far, operating from within a false narrative that we've bought into can influence the choices that we make or the actions we take in ways that might limit ourselves and cause us to achieve less than we could otherwise achieve, to create a kind of a mental prison that stems from the movie that we've bought into, but that isn't really true. So I'd say if we think of the word movie when someone says narrative, I think that's a pretty good way of understanding what's meant by buying into a certain narrative. And I think one of the best movies that illustrates this concept is not The Matrix, although that, in its way, but The Truman Show. In that movie, we really see a false narrative being used to intentionally limit someone's freedom. In this case, the character Truman, who's played by Jim Carrey, he's living inside this false narrative that's reinforced by things like the news that he listens to every day, and by all these friends who actually seem to care about him as a person, but who ultimately think it's better for him to believe this nice lie than to face the truth. And maybe they're giving him this lie because they do care about him. They don't want to hurt his feelings. They think for some reason that it's better for him to live inside of a lie than to face the truth that he's actually living inside of a cage. So as he goes through the movie, he keeps encountering these little pieces of evidence that cause him to question this picture that he has, that he's always believed of his reality. This storyline, this narrative, this movie that he's got inside his head in order to be able to function in his life. As he goes through and encounters this evidence, he finds little gaps in it. And the more gaps that he finds in it, it really starts coming apart. So the Truman Show demonstrates, it demonstrates this concept of being trapped inside a narrative, but it also demonstrates that it is possible to question your narrative and to step beyond that narrative, to reject this old false narrative and move out of that prison that you had once bought into. But it also shows that it's really difficult to do so, and there's going to be a lot of obstacles put in your way when you try. So what I'd like to suggest is the possibility that the narrative of human history that we're fed in school and that's reinforced on the news and in National Geographic documentaries with carefully crafted scripts and beautiful photography is actually a false narrative that functions like the false world that was built for Truman Burbank in The Truman Show. A false narrative that limits humanity and acts to keep us in a kind of artificial state of immaturity or adolescence, kind of like Truman was at the outset of the show. And there's a ton of evidence that supports this conclusion, evidence which has been really well documented by a whole group of excellent researchers and explorers and authors. And it's kind of like all those anomalies that Truman keeps encountering in his daily life, but the authoritative sounding voice of the news is constantly having to explain away and come up with excuses to explain, this falling, stage light that comes screeching down and lands in the street. The narrative of society comes on and says, oh, no, that's not what you think it was. We had a problem with an airplane. So there's this whole set of evidence out there that's like the evidence that Truman keeps encountering. And one set of evidence involves the Earth's ancient monuments. Each one of these ancient megalithic monuments, the really ancient ones, are incredible on an individual level and individually cause serious problems for the conventional narrative of history. That narrative that conventionally, the conventional narrative says humanity started out as these primitive hunter-gatherers, and then they slowly developed and emerged into the Paleolithic, and then the Neolithic, and then they became civilized, and some of the early civilizations started to, really emerge and just get more advanced and more advanced from there. And it's been kind of this long line of progress with some minor setbacks along the way, but generally a linear progression from totally primitive to this modern pinnacle of advancement that we've somehow reached today. That's the conventional narrative. It's reinforced in school and on TV. And the ancient monuments, which you can go visit, which contain examples of precision engineering and very sophisticated alignments and construction techniques, individually, those tend to shake that conventional narrative. But when you put them all together as a group, they totally rip the conventional narrative to shreds, because it can be demonstrated, and it has been demonstrated, that they are placed around our planet in specific geometric relationships to one another. The angles between these ancient sites and the numbers of degrees of latitude between them turn out to be special numbers that show up over and over again in some of the most ancient myths, going all the way back to the Gilgamesh epic, which, wasn't faked, and other sacred texts that we have, which shows that their placement was no accident. Additionally, as this graphic from a researcher named Jim Allison demonstrates, many of the most significant sites are actually on the same great circle. A great circle is a circle that's the size of the circumference of the globe, which suggests that whoever sited them in had a very precise understanding of the size and shape of our spherical planet and the technology to put these sites at these locations like that. And when you realize that these are some of the oldest sites that we know of, including places like Giza, Stonehenge is on a great circle with other sites. The fact that their builders put them on a great circle of our planet's circumference just blows away the conventional narrative of human history. You might hear professors at your college or university, or even different voices in the media putting forward different narratives for the cause of the Great Depression, but you will almost never hear anyone in an official capacity challenging this bigger narrative that we're trained to accept about the narrative of human history. And it's like this big giant Truman Show, like that dome that they kept Truman in. And any evidence that reveals the truth or something different than the narrative gets ignored or explained away with soothing explanations like that voice on the radio. Now, one reaction to all this might be, so what? What does this narrative of ancient history really mean to me? I'm a businessman or a businesswoman or a modern person living thousands of years after Stonehenge was built. But these false narratives can be very damaging, not just to ourselves, but to others. They can be used to excuse actions that trample on the natural, innate rights of other men and women, which is exactly what happened with some false narratives in the past. We actually get taught about some of these old false narratives in school to some degree because it's kind of safe now to point out how false they were. False narratives like manifest destiny, or the defenses that were given for slavery during the 19th century. It's obvious today that the excuses that men and women in society told themselves to explain away the idea of keeping other men and women as property, as slaves, were totally false. Same thing with manifest destiny, which is depicted in this oil painting from 1872 during the time that the federal government of the United States was actively stealing vast lands from the Native Americans and rounding the people themselves up into reservations and enforcing all of this with the U.S. Army in a prolonged, extremely vicious military campaign during which tens of thousands of Native American men, women, and children were brutally massacred, not just the ones who fought back, which those people who fought back were absolutely justified in fighting back, by the way, but also massacring non-combatant men along with women and children, entire villages sometimes. So that's an example of a false narrative that people in the U.S. bought into, and a false narrative that was based in part on the very same false narrative of history involving Stonehenge and, primitive mankind, blah, blah, blah. That, this narrative that said that humanity was progressing from more primitive to more advanced. That false narrative that is still around in many important ways. If you look at this painting from 1872, which is Still, 4 years before the Battle of the Little Bighorn, when Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull and the Sioux and other neighboring tribes defeated Custer and the 7th Cavalry, you can see that this painting reinforces a narrative that wanted the general public to use as their movie. You know, they didn't have movies then, so this painting was reinforcing that. But this is putting in place a movie in people's minds that they're using to explain what was taking place in real life all around them. In that movie, so to speak, that narrative, we see the East Coast on the right side of the painting, bathed in light with settled towns and ships coming in from the ocean. And then we see the armies of civilization marching forward, led by this goddess, Columbia, the same one who gave us the sea in Washington, D.C., that Columbia. She's carrying telegraph cables into the dark, murky west, which is the left side of the painting. And we see little groups of settlers led by scouts and explorers, and then followed by farmers tilling the soil and plowing the fields, coming from the east into the west. And then before them, in front of them, we see retreating the wild beasts like the bear and the bison or buffalo. And of course, the American Indians, the Native Americans, are being driven by this unstoppable forces of quote unquote progress. And that's what you're supposed to buy into. That's what people did buy into. That this is unstoppable, that it's a form of bringing light into darkness, that it's carrying the torch of progress that stretches all the way back into humanity's primitive past. You know, we used to be hunter-gatherers, but we've progressed into civilization, and you just can't stand against that. So this is the kind of false narrative that was used to excuse outright violence and killing. And I would suggest that this real acid test for whether something is a false narrative is whether it's used to excuse violence. That is, the violation of another man or woman's natural born right to life and liberty and property, their lands that they were living on. And I would suggest that while everyone today sees that these narratives that supported manifest destiny or slavery back in the 19th century are false, we may not be so clear on the false narratives that have replaced them, that are used to excuse the same sort of violence and violations today. The good news, however, is that we don't need to stay in a false narrative, in a false movie. We have to be really discerning to examine the narratives that are handed to us, or that we craft for ourselves, narratives that limit us the way that Truman's life was limited. There's that very poignant scene in the movie where Truman's friend is saying, you know, I know our lives haven't worked out the way we dreamed, but we just have to stay inside this false narrative. Well, what would it feel like to be like Truman and to walk out of a self-limiting narrative like that? And on a wider scale, we need to examine the narratives that are handed to us, that we craft, that we accept or that we build ourselves, that excuse the violation of the natural law rights of men and women, including excusing the use of violence against them, or that we buy in to excuse the violation that's being done to our own natural rights. What would it feel like if we saw people all around us on a wide scale waking up like Truman and walking out, in mass from a narrative that's being acted out like a modern day version of manifest destiny, and it's being used to keep people from objecting to some modern day version of what was done to the Native American tribes? I'd just like to end by saying that I myself have undergone some pretty major mental paradigm shifts where I realized that some really core narratives that I'd been buying into were false and were being used to excuse the violation of people's natural universal rights. And I think that this is an ongoing process. It's not like you just walk out of one narrative. We owe it to ourselves to constantly examine the narratives that we're letting shape our choices and actions. We're never too old to be like Truman and to break out of a mental cage that we have let ourselves be put into. And it may be that we have to do it many times during this life, not just once or even twice. We have to always be examining that narrative. Thanks for listening.